welcome to the three of you. They don't come from Lincoln, so Janet Weston, Dr. Janet Weston is from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Dr. David Griffiths is a Wellcome Trust Research Fellow, and Dr. Christine Richards is a psychologist from the Nottingham Healthcare NHS Trust Gender Clinic. So you're going to speak in that order. Janet, go for it.
Okay, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Just nodding at the back, okay. So thank you all for coming, and thank you to the organisers of tonight's event and the whole Transitional States programme, which is wonderful, I think. I'm going to be talking about the very sort of historical aspect of sex science and the body, and specifically a shift that is often discussed from sin to sickness. And what I want to talk about is what this shift from sin to sickness, when medicine started to become much more involved in matters of sex and gender, what that actually meant in the 20th century in fairly practical terms, and particularly what it meant for people who were being prosecuted for homosexual offences. I'm going to talk about Alan Turing in particular, and I'm guessing that most, if not all of you, will be familiar with the story of Alan Turing, but just in case, a quick recap. He received a posthumous pardon in 2013, having been convicted of a homosexual offence in 1952. And following that conviction, he received hormone treatment, which is now often described as chemical castration. You see that in a lot of the reports about Turing. And he sadly died less than 2 years later. So I want to think about whether that kind of medical intervention means that someone like Turing was seen as a patient rather than a sinner, whether he saw himself in that way. And to do that, I'm going to think about why a doctor in 1952 would prescribe like that, why a judge or a magistrate would sentence like that, and then briefly at the end, what Turing and other people in a similar position had to say. So to start with the doctor, endocrinology, the study of hormones, was still fairly new in the 1950s. There had been research and experiments in the early 20th century into how hormones might relate to sex and gender. One fairly famous / notorious example was that of a Viennese surgeon who experimented with testicle transplants to see whether this would rejuvenate older men, and he also claimed that it could be a cure for homosexuality, and the connection between those two outcomes in his mind is fairly revealing. Now, by the 1950s, that kind of approach had been largely discredited, both the specific method of transplantation and a lot of the thinking behind it. There had been experiments in the United States that had tried giving testosterone to men convicted of homosexual crimes to see if that would, quote-unquote, cure them, but it was profoundly unsuccessful. However, other research into hormones revealed that synthetic estrogens sometimes had a side effect of reducing libido, of lowering sex drive. Now, in the context of the 1940s and 50s in the UK, when there was a lot of social upheaval, there was a lot of anxiety about gender roles, family cohesion, social cohesion in the aftermath of the war. And related to that, there was a lot of concern about crime, about sexual crime, about homosexuality. Some doctors began to prescribe these synthetic estrogens to some sexual offenders, in some cases with that in mind, to try to reduce their libido, to reduce their sexual impulses. Now, it's important to say that this was very, very ad hoc, and no doctors saw this as a kind of be-all and end-all solution, for want of a better word, They recognised that there were a lot of unknowns, that people reacted very differently to these synthetic estrogens, that just because somebody had a reduced libido, that didn't mean that they couldn't commit a sexual crime, and that of course was one of the primary goals, to try to reduce sexual crime. And they also recognised that there was no way to force people to take these medications for the whole of their life. They were also concerned about some of the side effects, so it wasn't seen as a whole-scale solution. It was very much used then, as it is still used now, as an adjunct in the treatment of sexual offenders, with talking therapies, psychotherapies, occupying the primary position. And Alan Turing underwent psychoanalysis alongside his hormone therapy, which is often forgotten. So to say a brief word about the legal side, the sentence that Alan Turing received was a sentence of probation, so non-custodial sentence, on the condition that he underwent medical treatment. The exact nature of that treatment was left entirely up to his doctors. It wasn't mandated by the courts at all. And this was a very, very new provision. It had only been made possible 4 years earlier, in 1948, as a result of growing anxiety about the lack of success that just putting people in prison for all types of crime seemed to have. There was a concern that there should be more attention paid to what actually caused crime, including sexual crimes, including homosexual offences at this point, and that kind of attention to underlying causes should take into account the fact that perhaps treatment, in a lot of cases, was a better solution than punishment. So this kind of sentence was seen as quite progressive. It was endorsed by lots of legal minds, criminologists, psychiatrists, psychologists, people in child guidance, all those kinds of fields. But it was very, very rarely used. A historian by the name of Chris Waters has investigated men who were prosecuted for the same kinds of crimes as Alan Turing in the same time and place in Cheshire in the 50s. And he found, I think, that Turing was the only person to receive this kind of sentence. And I've looked at sexual offences more broadly around the UK, and it's a very similar picture. And indeed, of other kinds of crime too, it was very, very rarely used. The people most likely to receive this kind of sentence were relatively wealthy. They were kind of middle-class, respectable people, like Turing, who could afford to have a lawyer represent them, a lawyer to suggest that this might be a better solution for them than imprisonment or fines. They would have to plead guilty, and they would generally have to have committed a crime that could be seen as the result of an abnormality of the mind. So, interestingly, this kind of offence was very, very rarely used for crimes like theft and sexual violence against women. Where it was used, it was likely to be homosexual offences, indecent exposure, and crimes like that, that in the minds of lawyers and doctors at the time could be connected to disorder. So, to turn finally then to Alan Turing and others in a similar position and how they felt and saw themselves. Turing agreed to his sentence. That was a prerequisite. It couldn't be imposed on someone involuntarily, this kind of treatment. But of course his alternatives were very limited, so there's not much we can take from that. In his letters, he described psychoanalysis to his friends as quite good fun. And generally in his letters around that time, he's fairly upbeat, but it is very hard to know what he may have thought more privately. So some other examples from other people. Nat Burke, who was convicted in the 1940s of a homosexual offence and sent for psychotherapy, he absolutely hated it because he said, at that stage in my life, I didn't really want to discuss things with anyone, but he was advised by his therapist to reconcile himself to his sexuality, to find a way to live with it, and he eventually found that fairly helpful. Peter Wildeblood, who was imprisoned in the 1950s, very famously, described in his memoir his homosexuality as something akin to a benign disability, but he used the lack of treatment available for that disability in prisons as an argument against criminalisation. Fred Dyson, who was convicted in the 60s, was asked by the magistrate at that point whether he would go for a cure. And he said, "Madam, if there were a cure, they'd be lining up outside the doctors, they would. They'd be lining up to get the cure if there were such a thing." And he was promptly sent off to prison. And Pete Price, who wasn't convicted at all, but was sent by his GP to a psychiatric hospital for treatment in the 1970s, and he received aversion therapy, which is another form of treatment. He described that very, very vividly as nothing short of torture. So for those on the receiving end, medicine in its many guises could be a help. It could be a weapon against the law and a weapon against the language of sin. It could be more or less a piece of nonsense. It could be something that held out a lot of hope for them. And it could be something akin to torture. For some people, it was very, very progressive and a way forward. For other people, they perceived medicine as just an excuse for criminal behaviour. Medical thought itself was constantly changing and had a very, very uneasy relationship with both the law and its potential patients. So sickness and sin are still our cornerstones for thinking about sexual acts a great deal of the time. And I would finish by saying that I think we're still very much grappling with these legacies and with the current and future implications of medicine. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the invitation. The programme was brilliant, so thank you to Kiara for all your hard work and inviting me. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I'm going to talk about a little bit about my research. So my research is into a recent and contemporary history of intersex in the UK. Now, you may have heard of intersex, where individuals have biological sex characteristics that don't fit neatly into what we think of socially in our social constructions of male or female. You may have heard of older language, such as hermaphrodite, which is now considered inaccurate and offensive. Since a meeting in Chicago in 2005, the medical profession has tried to move away from both the language of intersex and hermaphrodite to a new language, a new classification scheme of DSD, that's disorders of sex development. So I'm going to talk about language and classification, and I'm going to talk about DSD a little bit, and I'm actually going to dip back into the history when I'm talking about sex chromosomes and talk about the same period of time, roughly. I'm going to talk about the 50s, interestingly. So the DSD, this disorders of sex development, which you can't tell from my face, don't particularly approve of, was one of the reasons that they said that this was going to be better than intersex language, was that the intersex language was imprecise and tended to bring up associations of gender and genitals, whereas DSD was promising to move away from genitals to a precise classification at some point in the future based on genetics, the promise of genetics. The history of intersex is a history of the attempts to classify sex, and, unfortunately too, of the surgical and hormonal interventions that have come and continue to come when bodies fall outside of these classifications. And just to say, these interventions are ongoing. They are often without consent, without full information, and sometimes without disclosure after the fact. So the history of intersex as a history of the classification of sex also has that kind of right front and centre there. But this history of classifications has looked at different sex characteristics, what I call biological sex characteristics at the start. So genitals or gonads, so testes and ovaries, or your cells of your body, your genes, your chromosomes, your hormones. And these kind of don't really line up in any neat way that a classification system might like them to. And what has generally happened in history is, no matter how much doctors in the medical profession try to say they're looking at other classifications and other characteristics, the focus always comes back to the genitals. However, this shiny new DSD classification system was supposed to be beyond this and was going to turn to genes and genetics to find the incontrovertible truth of sex. So DSD, to kind of work as a medical classification, actually has to not be about gender and genitals, and therefore has to be about genes. And as such, sex chromosomes and sex chromosome variations became very central to this classification system. So, quick primer, all with big scare quotes, that typical men are assumed to have XY chromosomes, and typical women are assumed to have XX chromosomes. It was actually not until 1959, to go back to the 1950s briefly, that it was discovered that there were sex chromosome complements, the karyotype, beyond XX and XY. It was discovered that you could have XXY, XYY, just one X, mosaics, etc. But this DSD consensus statement, which was published in 2006, and again, big scare quotes because there's no consensus. For this classification system to work, they made central Klinefelter syndrome and Turner syndrome, which are sex chromosome variations. Klinefelters often have XXY chromosomes, and Turner often have just one X. However, the big conference I'm talking about in Chicago in 2005, which then published this statement the next year, was funded by two big organizations. Like basically the next year after the publication of the consensus statement, one of those organizations published their own classification system in which they didn't include Turner or Klinefelters as DSDs. So straight away, medical professions who were at that meeting then were publishing their own statements saying, hold up, you've got to include Turner, you've got to include Klinefelters. And as they put it in their own words, it weakens the logic of DSD if you don't. So this is the logic of the classification system and how it works. And the reason it weakens its logic is because either they would say it leaves an undue focus, but I might say that it reveals that the system is always going back to genitals and gender. So despite the medical profession widely adopting DSD, as I've kind of briefly told you, there isn't an internal consensus even in medicine about what counts. And outside of medicine, it's fair to say that calling bodily variations disorders has not gone down well. Intersex activists have rightly emphasised that calling a natural bodily variation a disorder pathologizes the body, invests medicine with too much authority, and makes non-consensual surgical hormonal interventions more rather than less likely. The thing is that classifying bodily difference is complex and messy. And if we learn anything from science and history in medicine, it's that variation is sort of the rule. Variation is everywhere. However, these medical professions, despite this kind of internal lack of consensus, in publications about DSD, there's a faith, I suppose, in the promise of genetics and the DSD system at some point in the future to simplify and sort out this complex process. So this is kind of the contemporary context where we are now. And my historical research shows, or suggests rather, that DSD and the 2006 consensus statement are by far not the first attempt to kind of stabilise this mess of classification and the complexity of it, even with recourse to genetics. So, as I said, 1959, it was discovered that you could have these sex chromosome complements. Your karyotype could be other than XXXY. And during the 10 years before this, so this is very much about 1949 to 1959, in the 50s for this first bit of the evening, people with Klinefelters or Turners were often called sex reversals in medical documents, medical papers, simply due to the chromosome tests that were developed in the late 40s were not actually showing the doctors what they thought. They weren't seeing what they thought they were seeing, or however you want to put it. So, of course, this completely links into this history of kind of anxiety around sex, around gender, around sexual identity, sexual practices. But then even in 1959, this understanding that you could have an XXY karyotype, we didn't get away from kind of cultural understandings of sex and gender. The association of the X chromosome with female, the Y chromosome with male, was just so strong that this led researchers to a whole bunch of conclusions, now discredited, particularly in people with sex chromosome variations around their gender identity, about their sexuality, about personality, about criminality, all sorts. So, as I say, contemporary activists are arguing that the language of DSD is inherently pathologizing, and I completely agree, and obviously I don't have time to go into that as much as I'd like, but if you want to read decent, proper statements about this, you can go Googling and find OII, which is Organisation Intersex International, or Intersex UK, and the other intersex groups like that will have statements about why they are not taking up the DSD language. And also, what's really interesting that came up was when you talked about how medicine could be torture, and through the hard work of intersex activists who've been going to the UN and to kind of international bodies like that, international bodies like the UN have begun in the last few years talking about non-consensual genital surgery on infants in the language of torture. So there's that's what's happening, and I think that kind of doing the kind of analysis of contemporary medical scientific classifications that I'm doing, as well as the kind of historical work, adds another argument, probably against DSD perhaps, because those medical professionals in favour of DSD are almost saying, wait, hang on, the promise of DSD is yet to come. Genetics is going to solve this and going to sort it out. But not only does this not pay attention to the lived experience of intersex people, intersex activists who've been speaking about their experience for decades now, but it also is blind to this history of previous attempts to sort out the messy business of trying to classify different bodies through a grounding in genes.
Christina Richards. I'm Senior Psychologist at Nottingham, moved to be Lead Consultant at London, and you can email me if you want. I've got a website which has got all my stuff on, and if you want to hear my random thoughts, I'm on Twitter, so there we are. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about hormones, culture, and clinical practice, or specifically my clinical practice, I guess. I've written a number of books, some of which are incredibly expensive, and I don't recommend you buy for that reason, unless you own a library or you're very wealthy, in which case I do recommend you buy. But I've literally just published this one that's quite reasonably priced. So if you're interested in folk who identify as something other than just flat male, flat female, it's a good edited collection. So that.
Can I say I've read a bit and it's good?
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. For those that didn't hear, this person here has read a bit and it's good. Yeah.
It's really good.
Oh, thank you. Cool. So when I'm thinking about gender, I think when I'm thinking about trans stuff particularly, and non-binary folk, it's tempting to think about people in a little sort of silo, separate from cisgender folk, that is people who are, let's say, content to remain the gender they're assigned at birth as a sort of real rough category. And I think it's useful to think about gender more broadly. And the way I like to do that is look at advertising, because advertising both reflects the culture you find yourself in, and it's also sort of aspirational. We're meant to want to be like them and then buy the products in order to be like them. So let's look at some advertising. Here's an advert from 1952, from Chase and Sanborn Coffee. If your husband ever finds out you're not store testing for fresher coffee, this is what will happen to you. Apparently she very seldom did store test for fresher coffee. I don't know why that quite was. But quite specific sort of roles there for the people and the protagonists of the picture. 1961, the chef does everything but cook. That's what wives are for. Again, quite specific roles and quite a specific sort of advertising. 1970, the Mini Automatic for simple driving, advertised by a feminine person in the car there, and again with very sort of specific ideas. And then 58, together you'll choose a Morris Oxford. In the ladies' department we have comfort and roominess, smart gay colours, That's not the rainbow flag that we saw earlier. It means a wholly different thing in the 50s. Sort of easy gear change, all that sort of stuff, and he wants more miles to gallon, safe braking, you know, all the sort of very terribly practical stuff that a chap might want, of course. So quite specific sort of gendered roles there, and you might say, well, that's lovely, Christina, and you've got some cheap laughs, which is clearly what you're aiming for. But also there is, these are old adverts. The most recent one was from the 70s. And you know, surely things have moved on. We're not doing this anymore. Well, let's have a look, shall we? I pulled this off from 2017. This is from Vitabiotics, who do 2 different ranges. They do one for guys and one for women. And they do a sort of tablet for men and for women. And I've pulled out the text here, of course. And this is the one for guys, which has general health and vitality, something about sport and exercise there, to be on top of your game. You can't afford to be tired. So you have these, and then you can be, you know, much better at your sport and exercise. And it's the Medical Commission of the International Olympic Committee, England cricket bowler, that sort of thing. So there's a sort of idea that you're all right, but take these and you'll be pretty epic if you're a chap. And then if you look at the women's ones, it's for all-round support, reduction of tiredness and fatigue. No sport and exercise for the women, skin, hair and nails on this occasion. And of course we all need a little extra support for our skin, hair and nails. And then the scientifically balanced bit is recommended by the Department of Health for women from the first day of conception to the 12th week of pregnancy, because women of childbearing age sometimes need nutritional support before they even know they're pregnant. So really different discourses. On the one hand, we have this sport, exercise, Olympics, and on the other hand, we have, you know, you're going to have babies and have our tablets. And I also think there might perhaps be a little bit of a sort of deficit discourse, a sort of idea that if you're a woman, you're maybe not quite up to scratch, and have some of these tablets, and then you'll be all right. You know, you can have that support that you need. So there's discourses there about gender, and I think when we're thinking about gender, whether we're cisgender, trans, non-binary, or whatever, we're embedded in these wider cultural discourses. And these are discourses that cross history as well. So from 1902 there, the Women's Delight, the Dali box iron, and then this sort of idea from 1998, why men don't iron. Now these are not good ideas about gender. What I'd recommend is the wonderful Cordelia Fine's Delusions of Gender, which actually does have the science of gender in it. So if you're interested in an excellent book, other than a couple which I've written, which you may be interested in, then the Fine is absolutely magnificent. Okay, so, and another little thing here, which I thought was quite interesting. This actually came up on my phone not long ago. This vacuum cleaner is so good, even your husband could use it. And I thought maybe Google Analytics aren't quite as good as they think they are. So there's that. And of course, you know, it's not that dissimilar from the whole, you know, Cambridge chef for your wine. Now, when we're thinking about gender, I think it's useful to think about this idea of this sort of normal distribution curve. Now, normal is a statistical term. It doesn't mean normal like we normally use it. It just means this sort of bell curve shape. And a lot of stuff that humans have is distributed normally through this bell curve. So if you think there's not many people who aren't very tall, there's not many people who are really, really tall, most people sort of cluster somewhere in the middle. Or there's not many people who aren't very clever, there's not many people who are really, really clever, most people cluster somewhere in the middle. And my tendency is to think that actually, probably humans, short of all cultural stuff, would cluster somewhere in the middle. And actually, when you get more cultural flexibility, that's what people do, they start clustering in the middle. But what happens is that culture comes along and squishes us into a bimodal distribution. So it sort of says, okay, well, you guys have got to go there and you've got to go there. And a good example of this is if you want to go and buy something like a blue scarf. If I want to go and buy a blue scarf, I go to a department store and I have to physically put my body on the male floor or on the female floor. I can't sort of just buy myself a blue scarf. And why is that? It's because as a culture, we're squishing people, making them choose one side or the other. And that's why you get these things like words for boys and words for girls. So boys get running and girls get tiara or ice cream. So no sunshine for the boys and no swimming for the girls. And of course, if you do this from a very young age, if you make people choose products according to gender from a very young age, you get that bimodal squishing. Now, I'm not saying that there's no such thing as gender, because clearly there's something that's there, which is gender, which is very important, very key to people. And I'm not saying there's not such thing as sex, because clearly, again, there's an important key thing that is sex. But I am saying that this stuff isn't quite as one box over there and one box over there, and if you're born in one, you stay in one, and that affords you all of your desires and your pleasures and everything. I'm saying it's much more complex than that, and that culture plays a big part. Indeed, historically things have changed. So there's a couple of people here in curls and sort of frills and those sorts of stuff. One on the left is Robert Baden-Powell, hero of Mafeking and founder of the Scouting movement, and the other one is Abraham Lincoln's son. So again, we can see that our culture now, our cultural and gender norms now, are not what they may be in 100 years, and they're not what they were 100 years in the past. They're also globally, of course, not what they would be if you went to a number of other cultures around the world. So it's important to recognise that these things that we think are very innate, both are true for ourselves, and they are true for perhaps the person we meet on the Clapham Omnibus, the people we meet around us, but also they're complex, they're situated. They also go right back through time. So there's a picture here of a Bronze Age farmer from the best part of 5,000 years ago who has the skeletal skeletal matrices, so sort of the bone makeup in terms of the pelvis and the thighs of a phenotypic male, but who's buried in the female typical posture. So it would imply that there's something that's going right back through history, and we know this globally, we know this through religion, through different cultures, through different places, through different histories, that this stuff is not recent. This is something about humans and diversity. It's also something about animals, not just fish, as we see in Rough Garden's wonderful Evolution's Rainbow, but it's something that goes across vertebrates, invertebrates, all across the different animal areas and different types of animals that we have. It's something about being alive, in a sense. So when we think about trans folk, a lot of people want to think about etiology. That's our posh word for saying, why are people trans? And the first thing I'd say is, well, hang on a tick. We don't often ask, why are people cisgender? Why are people heterosexual? We always say, well, why are people this thing other than our norm that we've decided is our norm? And so I often say, well, that's not a very useful question. It's also not a very useful question clinically, because people want to know why they are trans, but very often it's to know where the blame should fit. But of course there's no blame for being trans. It's fine to be trans. Just fine, full stop. It's not fine to be trans, but, X, Y, Z. It's just fine to be trans. So you don't really need to know the cause, and even if you did know the cause, then what would you do? And what would you do is the big question. Having said that, there's a bit of evidence out there that there are neuronal differences in some trans people. In this instance, central subdivision of the bed nucleus, the stria terminalis and the hypothalamus. There's some evidence in the interstitial nucleus, the anterior hypothalamus. This sort of hypothalamic brain region which affects the pituitary, and that in turn affects some of our sort of sex-typical stuff, like puberty and lactation, those sorts of things. So there's these brain regions which, when we look at trans folk, appear to be in line with the gender of identity, not in line with the gender assigned at birth. Now, having said that, I'm sure there are some people for whom there are other causes, and that's fine. Indeed, if people choose to be trans, also fine, because I refer you to my earlier statement, it's fine to be trans. So why wouldn't you want to choose that? On to clinical matters then. So I'm going to talk a little bit about diagnosis, formulation, differentials, etiology, and hormones. Our posh clinical words for what is this, what might it be otherwise, what causes it, and then hormones as we're here. So in terms of diagnosis, I don't find it very useful. The reason I don't find it very useful is it's very Procrustean. You have to fit these categories, and if you don't fit those categories, you don't meet the diagnosis. But it's sort of like, well, but there's still someone who's in distress and they need a bit of assistance, so, what does that give us? They are broadening out. We have gender dysphoria in the current DSM, probably something like gender incongruence in the new World Health Organization International Classification of Diseases. But what I draw your attention to in this DSM diagnosis is this bit, where it diagnoses if you have a strong desire to be of the other gender or some alternative gender different from one's assigned gender. So the American Psychiatric Association recognise more than just two genders, that there are some alternative gender, there's a multiplicity of genders. I think that's really important to recognise, because this is quite a large, traditionally perhaps conservative organisation who are recognising non-binary folk. Indeed, the post office, you'll see there's got an MX, has a drop-down list. You can MX, pop that down, which is your common signifier if you're a non-binary person, and that seems entirely reasonable to me. Why would you not do that? And I think law and stuff is changing globally, and hopefully it's going to change in the UK soon, just to recognise people. Seems eminently sensible to me. Now, when I'm doing stuff clinically, one of the arguments that you sometimes hear is, well, trans people are mentally ill. That's not the case, actually. The APA had a position statement in 2013 where they said they were going to change the name from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria, particularly because it's not a disorder. They retained the diagnosis in order to access hormone surgeries, those sorts of things, because you need to have something in order to get the money to do hormone surgeries, to do an intervention. So they retain it for a pragmatic reason. So it's not a disorder, but sometimes people say, well, actually, is it a mental illness? And the answer is no. And the reason for that is if you take away minority stress, so this is the stress people experience because they're subject to prejudice. So if you have a group of people who are discriminated against, you get anxiety and depression because of that, of course. So when people aren't discriminated against, you don't have the anxiety and depression, people do fine. So it doesn't follow, therefore, that being trans and non-binary is itself disordered. In a sense, if you're in a society where you're subject to prejudice, it is the society which is disordered, because if you fix that, everyone's fine. So the answer is you don't have higher rates of what we call comorbid mental illnesses. This is schizophrenia, bipolar, those sorts of diagnoses. And also, you don't have higher rates of anxiety and depression when people aren't subject to stress. You can have some people who are have problems interacting with reality, where they have a psychotic illness, and very rarely those people might think that they have something going on with their gender. Vastly more often, people who have those issues are actually trans. It doesn't stop you being trans, of course, but just very rarely it can present as that. Almost so rarely to the point where it wouldn't concern the general person. There are some people who have what's called body dysmorphic disorder. That's where people feel that a part of their body doesn't belong to them, in sort of very rough terms. And sometimes that can present looking a bit like trans, and then you can talk to people, but of course you can have that and again be trans. Some people who really don't feel happy with themselves and want to sort of take away parts of themselves, and again that can sometimes present as trans. Again, very rarely. Vastly more common is trans people subject to prejudice who are self-harming because they're very distressed, because they're subject to prejudice. Sometimes because they're not able to transition or present themselves. So that's a much more common reason. So. And then psychosocial development. Some people are going through a period where they're trying to work out sort of who they are, and they're doing stuff with gender, and that's very reasonable, very normal behaviours, but it's certainly something that you're always going to consider clinically. Now, what do I do? My process can largely be broken down into two bits. One, is the person trans or non-binary? So this is like, or are they in the middle of a psychotic illness and they're actually not quite engaged with reality at the moment? It's pretty easy clinically to engage with that, as one might imagine. So that's the first bit. And then the second bit, because we work in nationalised healthcare, is this going to work? Is this going to work in the real world? Now, there might be an argument in some other healthcare systems where to say, well, okay, I'm willing to do this, I'm willing to take responsibility if it all goes to hell in a handcart. But within socialised healthcare, where the taxpayer pays for it, it's not just that somebody wants it, it has to be a positive benefit, it has to actually be useful, because otherwise that money should be spent on, kids with cancer or some other thing. If it is of use, then of course we should absolutely spend it on trans people. And the great joy of working in the field of transgender healthcare is actually when you do support people, they go on and do amazing. is very often you have people who have depression, anxiety, really quite severely sometimes, and then they get the assistance they need, and those things lift to a really quite marked degree. So it's a really useful and a useful intervention. It's a useful thing to spend money on, because you have people who are just that much happier, that much more able. And I suppose from a really sort of corporate way, they pay more tax. So if you wanted it from that way, there you go. But just like humanitarian reasons we should do this. So is the person trans and non-binary, is it going to work in the real world? That's the two things. Other things people can do and that are important: friends, family, community support, really important, as we discussed. Expressing people's identity, having assistance and being able to do that's really important. Assistance with voice, hair removal, hormones, surgeries are really useful. And indeed, for when people carefully selected for surgery, the majority of people do better after surgery than before. Sometimes people think there's a debate about that, and hopefully I've included enough references for you to think that that debate is shut. There is not a debate about this anymore. Supportive psychotherapy can be useful if people want it, a place that people can talk through stuff, talk through the difficulties they might be having. Mandatory psychotherapy is awful, it makes people worse, so one should never do it. And then the Gender Recognition Act 2004, which provides for people to change into a binary gender at the moment, and is being revised at the moment, of course, and to be confirmed. We'll see what happens with that. So hormones, I was invited to talk about hormones. There are masculinising hormones, which people may opt to have. And by no means all people want hormones, of course, and by no means all people want surgeries. There's a sort of myth that everyone wants physical interventions, and that's absolutely not the case. People need to choose what they want such that they can express themselves in the appropriate way for them. It would be ridiculous to sort of feel that one couldn't express oneself in one's birth assigned gender, and then to feel that, oh well, I must do this other thing, and then not be able to express yourself there. So masculinising hormones, testosterone gel injections most commonly, facial or body hair come from masculinising hormones, increase in musculature, deeper voice, clitoral growth. If you've got the genes for it, you go bald. A lot of people aren't keen on that, but them's the rub. Menses stop. And infertility is an interesting one, because you may lose fertility, you may not. So it's important both to store gametes, which is in eggs most commonly, if you want to have the option to have children in the future, but also to use contraception. So sort of got it coming out going in a sense. And then feminising hormones, estrogen gel tablets. Most often people need a testosterone blocker, something like a gonadotropin-releasing hormone analogue. You get breast growth, and if it's well managed, you should have reasonable breast growth, although again it depends on your genes, because the hormones simply trigger the genes. So if you've got the genes for a smaller sized breast, you'll have a smaller sized breast, of course. Perhaps slightly less body hair, but not massively so. Less facial hair, but not massively so. Less musculature, erectile loss, and again infertility. There's no change in voice, and there's not necessarily any capital hair regrowth. As in, if you've lost your hair, then you'll continue to do so. Okay. So a range of things. Now, the difficulty for non-binary folk is sometimes that they want some of those changes and not others. But we're not at a position in terms of our endocrinology, that's our hormones, whereby we can actually make very specific targeted changes. What you do is you go through puberty, and then you can stop at a certain point if you want. But that does mean that some things that go together, like for example a deeper voice and body hair, you can't pick one or the other of those. You're gonna have them both. So there's some discussions to be had with non-binary folk about the specific interventions that they would like. And I think broadly that's everything that I wanted to say. Thank you very much.